Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Invisible Wound. This podcast is a limited series of 6 episodes, which is part of a larger project called Hakara, Facing Transgenerational Trauma. This project was initiated by AMCHA. AMCHA is an organization that was established in 1987 by a group of Holocaust survivors and devoted mental health professionals. My name is Sharon Ryba-Kahn. I'm a Berlin-based filmmaker and a third generation of survivors of the Shoah. This is the perspective I'll be speaking from. For this podcast, we will be traveling to what is known to be the world's oldest continent, and which we know as Australia. The Aboriginal people of Australia are the custodians of the world's oldest living culture, a culture that is 60,000 years old. In order for me to avoid any types of cultural appropriation, I ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and for them to share where they are from and how they perceive trauma, and also how fighting trauma is present in their work and in their lives. We are very lucky to have Uncle Boydie on this podcast today, and this would not have been possible without the help and dedication of Abe Schwartz. Welcome, Abe. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So my name is Abe Schwartz. I'm a Melbourne man. I got to meet Uncle Boydie. Others know him as Alfred Turner, but very few. Most only know him as Uncle Boydie. About December 2002, at a Holocaust Centre event at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, when the first public honouring of his grandfather's activism happened in the Melbourne Jewish community, and we became friends, over the next few years. And since about 2008, we've been travelling mostly Australia, but 3 times overseas to help tell the story of Uncle William Cooper.
Abe, why is it important for you to tell this story?
As I grew up in an Australia that had no appreciation or knowledge of the first peoples of this country, the more and more I looked back on my education as a man in my 20s and 30s and 40s, it dawned on me how ignorant I was about the lives of the First Nations of this country. When I found out that I already started taking an interest and started going on a few reconciliation committees and things a few years before I met Uncle Boydie, and I made it my business to get a job in the area where he was working, not knowing of where he was living, not knowing of his existence. And when I heard the story that it was his grandfather that stood up for our grandfathers, me being Jewish, when almost nobody else in the world would stand up to Hitler, when the stories of Kristallnacht were on the newspapers all over the world, but still most of the world did nothing, or very tokenistic stuff. And yet I heard that the First Nations of Australia, who I know nothing about, stood up for us whilst they got so much of their own. I was just blown away, Sharon. So I made it my business to meet Uncle Boydie, and he was such a gentleman, and he's become like my best friend. And we made a task to help him finish his grandfather's business, and I'm proud to have done my little bit. What he calls his grandfather's unfinished business.
Thank you so much for the intro, Abe. And so let's give Uncle Boydie a call.
Uncle, hi, Uncle. You just got home?
Just made it.
Really? What were you running
the door?
Were you running up the garden path because you thought, oh no, Abe's ringing at 9 o'clock with that woman from Germany? Uncle, do you want to make yourself comfortable somewhere? And Sharon will be on the phone. Sharon, can you hear Uncle Boydie?
I can hear both of you. Hi. Hi, Uncle.
Hello, Sharon.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
Happy birthday, almost.
Oh, thank you.
I just would like to say that I acknowledge the land of the Yorta people, and I pay my respects to you as an elder, to the elders past and present.
Good, thank you.
So, Uncle Boydie, could you please introduce yourself?
Well, my name's Alfred George Turner, and I was born in Melbourne, Australia. I'll be 93 tomorrow, the 25th of October. I was born in 1928, and what I'm saying here is just what happened to me, what I've heard, and what was done in my time growing up in Australia.
Uncle, would you like to share a few stories about your childhood?
Yes, I think I can do that as much as I can remember. I was my father's family. Of course, my mother was Aboriginal, and my father was white.
Okay.
And they split up when I was a baby. And I was taken from Melbourne to Barmer, a little place on the Murray River. And that's where I stayed with my grandfather and grandmother until in 1933 he went to Melbourne to live. And my grandmother came back a few months later and took me down to Footscray, Melbourne, where I went to school there for about another 4 years. I was about 5 or 6 when I went down there, years old, and I stayed with them and went to school in Footscray.
Uncle, tell Sharon the story about when you wanted to go to school and your mum wanted you to go to school, and what happened when you got to the school building with the school. You know the whole story, I mean?
Yeah. Well, as I said, Sharon, I went to the mission school, and they only taught the kids to 3rd and 4th grade standard, and that's all the education there was at that school. So my mother, we lived in Victoria, as I said. My mother took me away from the school at the mission, and her and another lady with 2 boys, 2 Aboriginal boys. Mothers took us up and knocked on the door of the white school. Well, there was no Aboriginal kids there. So we knocked on the door, and out come the teacher, and he said, "What do you want?" That's the way they used to talk to the Aboriginals. "What do you want?" And my mother did the talking. She said, "We brought the boys up here to enrol them in your school." And he said, "No, we don't want you here." And he slammed the door in our face. So what he didn't know, the teacher didn't know, that we knew that the inspector of schools was in Barmer having his lunch at the local hotel. So we met him on his way back to the school. Our mothers told him the story and what had happened beforehand. And he said to our mothers, "Leave it to me." And he took us by the hand, 3 of us, went and opened the door and forced his way into the school. And he said to the teachers, "These boys are to stay," and sat us down at a couple of desks. And he couldn't do anything about it, the teacher. So I finished my schooling there in the white school.
Your grandfather died when you were a little boy, but you do remember him. So let's talk a little bit about him and what you remember of William Cooper.
He was a big man. Grandfather would have been 6 feet, probably over 6 foot, and a big built man. And he used to walk from Footscray, as I said before. He used to walk into town, and as I'm telling you this because he took me with him a few times, and I was only about 8 years old. And I'd carry his books or whatever he wanted to take with him, and we'd walk into Melbourne, as I said, 11 kilometres one way. So it's 22 kilometres we had to walk home. And them being on the pension, he couldn't afford bus fares or train fares, so he walked.
What language did your grandfather speak?
Well, he would have spoken in the Boydie language as a boy.
The mission that you were speaking about, Kamarganja. First of all, it's important to say that these missions, reserves, and stations were areas where Aboriginal people were placed in after being forcibly removed from their traditional lands. And secondly, Kamarganja was established in 1888, and the reserve existed until 1953.
Yeah, before they built Kamarganja, there was a fellow businessman. He was in Echuca, a town of Echuca. So he sold up and bought a bit of land and put some huts on it, and went around the district trying to find people who needed help, like they were sick. If they were sick, he'd put them in a horse and cart and take them back to this little place he had built the huts. Well, grandfather finished up there. Him and his mother and siblings. They finished in at this I suppose you'd call it a hut. And anyhow, they were taken there by the owner. And the fellow that built up this place took a liking to grandfather, and he put a lot of time in educating him to read and write. And by the time he was nearing 20 years of age, he could write a decent letter. So that from then on till he died, that's what he did. He wrote letters to all the people he thought might help him in the fight for his people, because these people weren't treated right. And that's all he thought about, was what he could do for his people.
Your grandfather, William Cooper, founded, together with other members such as Margaret Tucker, the AAL, the Aboriginal Association League. And they were mostly active in the mid and late 30s. What do you remember about this time?
I can remember, I never knew much about it, because my job was to, at meetings, they'd come to the house and have their meetings around the bedside of my grandfather. And I would answer the door and bring them in and get them a seat, and they'd have their meetings in his bedroom. They were pretty busy people because they had a lot on their plates. And as I said, they would meet at the house. My recollection of grandfather, he used to sit in bed with a red blanket around him, writing letters. Of course, there was no TV in those days either. And that seemed to be all he'd done. Like to a boy my age, right. All he'd done was read and write letters. Of course, they travelled around to other missions, as I said. In Victoria, one was called Lake Tyers, one of the missions, and that was over 100 miles away. Well, they used to travel down there from time to time because they were having trouble too, the Aboriginals down there. But I think he's travelled to Melbourne a few times. So you can imagine how hard it was for them. because they had very little money. It was only pension that they lived on. He didn't get anything for it because they were battling to go these and visit these places. I think he went to Sydney to a few meetings. Well, they had to drive up there. They couldn't afford train fares. So the white lady that used to be on the committee, she had a car. And they'd all pile into her car and she'd drive them to Sydney and back.
So tell me why you think that your grandfather was fighting also for the Jewish people, knowing that his own people were suffering so much.
I was there when he was fighting for the Jewish people. Every day there'd be pictures and someone writing about what was happening in Germany. And this went on for a couple of weeks, and he decided that he'd do something about it. So he called a meeting, and they decided they'd write a letter to the German people, and they took this march. That's about 11 kilometres. And there was mostly Aboriginal people in the march. And when they got in there, the German ambassador wouldn't come out to speak to them. They blocked the place up before they got there. Other than looking after the work he'd done for the Jewish people, of course he had a lot of work to do for his own people, the Aboriginals, and that kept them busy. Him and 3 or 4 or 5 of the committee used to travel distances to some of the mission stations to see into different things that were happening on the stations. And of course he was a busy man writing letters to politicians and the like, and putting a lot of the work, telling them about the work he'd done and was doing.
Uncle, when did your grandfather pass away?
When I was about 9 or 10 years of age, they sent me back to my mother, where I was in Shepparton, a town in 40 miles from Barmer. And my grandfather took ill, and this was 1940, and he took ill, and they brought him up to Marupna, where we lived, and he went to the doctor, and the doctor put him in hospital there, and that's where he passed away. And he's buried at the Aboriginal settlement at Cumragunja Aboriginal settlement. That's between Echuca and Athalia, and he's buried there. I put it down to the fact that if my grandfather hadn't taken me as a boy, I could have been anywhere today, and doing other things. And I've had a good life, and I put that down to my grandfather and grandmother.
Uncle, the racism and injustice you endured as a boy on the mission must have been terrible. Can you tell me about it?
There were missions in every state of Australia because the people they had to build houses on some land and put them on the missions so that they could fence their farms off. And I always thought they wanted the land, but they didn't want the people. And the people weren't allowed to go, and they fenced the missions off, or the farms off, and the people, the Aboriginals couldn't find or couldn't go onto the place, and they couldn't go and look for food like they used to before white man came, and it was pretty hard for them. They used to get rations, food, like rations every so often, every week, I think it was. They'd hand out the rations to them.
Who handed the food?
Well, they had managers on them to manage the mission stations, and those managers were either returned soldiers or ex-policemen. So they were pretty rough on them, on the people. And I witnessed it because I went to school on the mission. I grew up on the Victorian side of the Murray River, the main river in Victoria. And I grew up on the Victorian side, and the mission was on the New South Wales side. But the townships around where the mission was, they treated the Aboriginals like animals. But I grew up, the remainder of my life I spent in Mooroopna here. That's near Shepparton. Shepparton is a big town in Victoria. And I finished my schooling here in Mooroopna, and I didn't come across much racism here when we moved.
How old were you?
But I was about 15 when I left Burma to come and live here in Mooroopna, and life was pretty good for me because they wouldn't have known that I was Aboriginal because I'm fair skinned, and but the darker skinned people, they copped it a bit. It was terrible to live in those times. You had to wait in a store until all the whites were served, and then they'd serve you, and things like that.
Are there other stories you remember?
I married a girl off the mission, the Aboriginal mission, and she had a brother, a younger brother, and he was a worker, and he bought this new car. It was a new Ford, and he went to a place called Swan Hill for a bit of a drive. That's about 100 and something miles about west of the mission. It's a big town, Swan Hill. And as they drove into the town, he had a couple of mates, Aboriginal mates, in the car with him. And the police car pulled him up. And he said, where do you come from? And they said, oh, we just come for a drive to have a look around. He said, well, go down and have a look at the street, he said, and then go back to where you come from. He said, I don't want to see you in the street again. And the same thing happened to me in another place called where was another dark chap. I was a plasterer, would plaster houses and different things. So they took me and this other Aboriginal fella up and dropped all our camping gear out in the house, and we got cleaned up and had to go and have a bit to eat. So we were marching down the street, going down to the main street to find a place to eat. And as we were walking along, a car pulled up alongside us, and a policeman came out, got out of the car, and he came over and he said, where are you going, boys? And we said, oh, we're just going down to have a bit of tea tonight. And he said, where are you from? And we said, Shepparton. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, well, go down and have your tea, he said, and I don't want to see you down the street again. And that's what today, like, as I was saying, I did witness quite a bit of it in different places.
So did racism also affect job opportunities?
In my childhood days, they were lucky if they got a job once in a year. Like, there wasn't too many that worked because they didn't know anything when they left the mission, and all they could do was pick fruit and vegetables and that sort of work. I done a lot of that when I left school too, but I was lucky enough to get in and learn a trade. Well, I think I was the only one that got into a trade at like my age. There's a lot now that are builders and everything else, you know.
On a completely different note, how come everyone calls you Uncle Boydie?
Well, when I was born in Carlton, Melbourne, and I had two sisters. One was about 5 and one was 3. And when Mum took me home from the hospital, she said to the girls ran out to meet us, and Mum said, look what I've got, a little boy. He's a little boy. So my eldest sister said, Boydie. And that stuck. Everybody called me Boydie, my grandparents. I didn't know my name was Alf until I was about 15, because everybody called me Boydie.
And Uncle, you spent your entire life, it seems, to make sure that people would know who your grandfather is, right?
Well, he wasn't known. And Abe, I never forget Abe. He done a lot in getting the name William Cooper out into the world. We went to Germany, of course, and lots of other places on the continent. And it was we put about 10 years, I think, Abe and I, and to get the name of William Cooper recognised for what he did.
And why did you do that? Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I decided that, and Abe too, decided that he should be known for what he did. Like,
and when did you decide that?
Was recognising what he did. So that was the reason we went to the continent.
And when did you decide that?
I think it was in my mind that if no one else was doing it, I had to do it because I lived with him and I knew how hard it was for him. So Abe helped me and do that, and I'm are very glad to have Abe. You know, to recognise that he was the one person that helped me do that. Now the name is known in Germany, all over the continent. In America, it's right around the world. You can ask people and they know the name and what he did. And that's all I wanted to do that for.
That's very moving and very beautiful, that you did that and that you paid your respects, I guess, in a way, right?
Yeah.
Uncle, is there anything else you think is important for us that you want to tell me?
Oh, just that you can help and put my name, put grandfather's name up, and help to have his name around the world too. I think what he done for his people, and he was just all he thought about was his people, and that's what he did. So if you could help further his name around, I think that'd be nice if you could do that.
And I think we're doing that by us talking to one another, actually.
Yeah. Well, I was pleased that you got something out of it, Sharon. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, and I hope to meet you one day in person.
Okay. Good to hear you and talk to you, Sharon.
Good to talk to you so much. Thank you. Thank you for all of it.
Good. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Invisible Wound. In our next episode, we will be speaking to Tiriki Onus and Alec Morgan, who collaborated on a beautiful documentary film called Ablaze. Tiriki Onus is the grandson of Bill Onus, and of course, Bill Onus and William Cooper, so Uncle Boydie's grandfather, knew each other.